what you're supposed to do if you want your paper to show up on many search engines. So, well done me. On first sight, there could be the impression that my paper makes two boringly obvious and one obviously foolish claim. I hope to refute that impression in the following. So, the first boringly obvious claim is climate change is caused by a very complex set of interactions of different kinds of numerous past and present people. Many of the actions are not only innocent in the sense that they don't fully qualify in the sense of being voluntary, in the sense that we deliberately thought about the outcomes and said, like, oh, well, anyway, we do it. Some of them do, others don't. I mean, subsistence emissions are an example. I'm more critical about historical emissions, but subsistence emissions do count for me. So there are limits to in how far we could say that it's deliberate action that is blameworthy or even fully morally significant. Then many of the harmful consequences are the effects of the interaction of unforeseeable consequences, often foreseeable consequences, but consequences in circumstances that have all different kinds of origins. So, in a sense, I find it really, really, really hard to define what people should have done so that we are not in this predicament. What is it that we did that we shouldn't have done if we wanted to prevent climate change? So I think there are responsibility gaps in the sense that it's hard to define what people should have done or should not have done if we want to assign responsibility for climate change. Now, if there are responsibility gaps, it's obviously a good thing if we find a way to close them so that we don't continue to go on causing climate change involuntarily, or if we continue to cause climate change, that we have an easier job to say, oi, you're responsible, you pay for it. Now, that's, I think, fairly obvious. Now, what's fairly foolish is my claim that we ought to address climate change by democratic means. Yes, democracy is all red and all, but we all read Steve's work, and we read a lot of other accounts, even more depressing, on why democracy might not be the best way to effectively combat climate change. The incentive structure is skewed completely against it. So, and that's apart from the fact that some of the nations contributing quite substantially to climate change are not entirely democratic in the first place. Now, the second boring claim, or boringly obvious claim, is that if we want to assign remedial responsibility based on the responsibility for bringing about the problem, we need to fulfill a set of conditions. So, if we want to say someone ought to do something about the problem because they change it rather than because they can, then we need to assign morally significant responsibility. And for that, we need an account of morally significant agency as well as morally significant causations. Two huge topics with huge literatures. Fun. Today, I'm more concerned with causation. We need an account of which of the numerous origins, contributing factors, matter from a moral perspective, from a normative perspective. So we kind of need an account of which acts and omissions are within the sphere of acts and omissions that an agent ought to be concerned about. In other words, there are possible impacts of our agency that we ought to be concerned about, and then there are some possible implications or consequences of our acts that we really don't have to worry about. So if my presentation here bores you to the degree that you decide to give up philosophy and rather build a huge bomb to finally shut all of us up, that's not usually my responsibility if you blow up the universe, even if I bored you. So we need an account of what of the contributive factors matter and why. And this is what I'm really interested in, and I think this is really interesting. I call it the sphere of prospective responsibility. And I make 4 assumptions at this point. So, then I made a huge jump in the topic, never mind. I come back to that point in a minute. I make 4 general assumptions at this point. So, there is reasonable disagreement as to what are the actions that we ought to consider, or the consequences of our actions that we ought to consider, and which ones that we don't ought to consider. There are just so many principles that we could apply as to what we should consider. I mean, if I knew that one of you secretly harbored the desire to build a huge bomb and only needed to be bored enough to do it, then I probably shouldn't bore you. Shouldn't do that anyway, but which conditions are these precisely? And we are philosophers, we disagree. It happens. Now, deciding which conditions apply isn't merely a matter of, ontology. It has a lot of normative implications of what we think human beings are, what we think human beings ought to be, what we think how human beings ought to react to each other. All this, if we should be in a position to say, well, you just have to deal with me insulting you, or if we say you ought not do this, you ought to take responsibility. In that sense and also I think that this sphere of prospective responsibility is to a certain degree a social choice. So it's not given, it's developed out of a social practice, what we use in everyday context, even though we disagree in the details, we have a rough feeling what we ought not consider. But that develops over time, that changes over time. It's a social practice. Now, I think that social practices need to be evaluated fairly regularly as to whether they are morally adequate. And I think we have a responsibility to look into what we do. Now, given that we disagree, I furthermore claim we ought to discuss this, and if we can't agree on principle, we need to agree on a procedure on how to decide on this fairly. Here comes democracy. So when I try to apply this to climate change, I started this paper when I thought about, so what is the relevant act causing climate change? And I came up with 2 stories. The first story is like the collective action story, and it seems the straightforward story. The second is the tragedy of the common story, not that original either. The collective action story is everyone who ever emitted is part of the problem. That would make all of us. But so the agent, the relevant agent would be all of humanity, but humanity isn't an agent, so that's not really a solution. So we would have to break down which contributions are normatively significant. And I don't think there is an easy way to break this down. I don't think there is any straightforward way to break this down. I think it is statistically possible to calculate or approximate our individual contribution to the problem. And several people play with numbers and get to outcomes. But I think, well, that's the contribution, that's not responsibility. To say what is the responsibility for the problem, we need to bring in all kinds of normative considerations. Did we have a choice about making this contribution? Did we know we were contributing to the problem? All kinds of considerations, which happen to be controversial among philosophers, surprise. So before we can say anyone contributed in a normatively significant way to climate change, we need an account of what it means to emit more than their fair share, and an account of what's everyone's fair share. The equal per capita account seems on very first sight to be a good candidate here, but Simon Caney crushed that hope and took that principle apart and showed that even that seemingly straightforward doesn't work. So we need an account of what people should have done to say what they did wrong and why we have a problem and why they should be held responsible for it. Now, the second story, the tragedy of the common story, says that the problematic act of causing climate change isn't emitting as such, or even emitting more than one's fair share. The problematic act is not getting organized and organizing emissions in such a way that we don't get to the problem. So it's an omission. We have climate change because we never organized our emissions in such a way that we could prevent the problem. So, according to this story, what we need to have done to prevent climate change is to radically change the incentive structure. We currently have an incentive structure of the tragedy of the common kind where it is reasonable for all of us to do something that is going to bring out the worst possible collective outcome. So we need to change this incentive structure, and well, there are two immediate ways. One would be if we could come up with a technology that allows us to have all the benefits from emissions without all the negative impacts. That would be grand, then we don't have to worry about it anymore, but that's not going to be, I don't think that's very likely. So the other way is we need to cut the link between benefiting from emissions and contributing to climate change, and the only way to do this is politically or via social action. Now, one could hope that individual action, change of the kind that Eric pointed, where we get together and organize ourselves informally, could be a pathway to the solution, or even every one of us cutting down their carbon footprint would be part of the solution. I don't think it would be anywhere near enough without attacking the skewed incentive structure. So I still am overly optimistic because I still think that we might be able to get organized enough to agree that we need to change the incentive structure and work towards that. That might be too optimistic. But even if we want to do this, if we say, okay, let's tackle climate change through collective action, there are two questions we need to address. The first is, where do we set the threshold? And then, whose responsibility is it to organize the necessary institutions to make sure that we don't get above this, that we choose the kind of principles we need, that we close the responsibility gaps in such a way that we remain below the threshold of overall emissions or overall compensation or whatever we do. The first question is empirical as well as normative and controversial again. And the second question seems to bring us back to the predicament that we already had with our collective action story. So who's responsible for getting organized? Well, kind of all of us. So here we go. Humanity is responsible. Everyone is responsible. That means no one's responsible. Not helpful. But I think, unlike in the collective action case, in this context, we have a way to identify people who are particularly responsible by what, well, Simon Caney uses the power responsibility, calls it the power responsibility principle. I prefer the Spiderman principle. But it comes very close to what Eric was saying, like those who are in a particular good position to do something about the problem are particularly responsible to do it. I think that it's not entirely unproblematic to say just simply because you can, you ought. But I think it avoids a number of problems, and it gives us a fairly plausible account to say, like, if you can do something about creating the kind of institutions that help us to divide the burden of preventing a problem fairly, then you're the kind of person who's called on to do so. And if you moan about being a powerful, privileged person, I'm not overly sympathetic. Now, I come back to the question, why should we do this in a democratic way? Especially with climate change, the biggest problem seems to be we're running out of time. We need an effective solution fast. And democracy is very likely to give us an ineffective and slow solution. So why do I go on with this? I mentioned at several points in this presentation, this is controversial, this is controversial, this is controversial. There are, for most of the principles about what we ought and ought not do with regard to climate change, not even us in this room is going to fully agree. And all of us would have good reasons why we think we should prioritize this over that moral principle, or skew that value, put it a little higher than that, and take this empirical concern more serious than that. I think this agreement is reasonable. And I just think that the power responsibility principle is, well, first of all, it is a principle that we have a problem, we need to deal with it. So efficiency is on the forefront. However, as a principle of justice, it must be compatible with other principles of justice and cannot completely disregard other relevant normative concerns. So our duty to close responsibility gaps that remain on either account of what caused and continues to cause climate change. I mean, it's not like that's the causation is in the past. We keep causing the problem every single day. All of this, given that there is reasonable pluralism on how best to do it, I think it would be unjust in one respect if we didn't give all the proposals a fair hearing and if we didn't let the vote decide. Now, luckily, that does not commit me to think that we ought to let people vote on any kind of climate policy in the current context of current democratic institutions, because I think that would be a road to disaster. I could argue that the prospective responsibility that I assume we have to close responsibilities comes combined with the duty to do so in a just manner, and that this certainly involves creating the kinds of institutions that are both effective, because nothing can be just if it's completely ineffective, and thus leads to lots of injustices, and procedurally just in the sense of considering people's rights to have a say and not to be bullied over by someone who happens to be on the top. The point that I find most interesting here is the idea that prospective responsibility is a social practice, and that as a social practice it should be something that we explicitly address. How do we assign responsibility, and that it should be decided on democratically, because the idea that assigning responsibility is a social practice, I found, well, maybe I read the wrong literature, but I didn't find enough on it. I found some vague notions, yeah, we know this, but no details. So if you either have good literature points or any pointers on how to develop that idea, come on. I think that would be
the quick comment is just, maybe in the paper you already do you engage with Tim Morgan's chapter in Ethics for a Broken World? Because if not, it might be worth having him as an interlocutor, because he imagines sort of from the future where everything's ruined by climate change that it was democracy's fault. So that might just be a good person to have as an opponent, seeing as you're going to do it.
I should definitely look that up.
And then the question is, I was just wondering throughout the presentation, why you seem so interested in particular on responsibility via culpable causation. So it seems like there's lots of ways people are interested in responsibility to do something about climate change, as you know, I'm sure. So, but it seemed like you were very fixated on a specific kind. Who's culpable for? Who was the agent? Like, who did something so that they can be liable, backward looking, and we can pin responsibility from them? And I just wondered, is that for a reason, so you think that gives us like the strongest account of pinning responsibility on people, or that will be the most motivating? Or is it, otherwise why not think, well, duties of assistance to prevent future suffering, or duties not to benefit from, so make use of some other category. So the question was why in particular these culpable kinds of responsibility?
Well, the main reason is more personal. I happen to be employed in a research project on historical emissions, which dealt with that question, and I found the accounts not entirely satisfactory, so I got stuck with it, and since I'm not satisfied yet, I keep digging. It might not be, I don't think it is the most promising account, especially with the respect to the urgency of the problem. If we say, what should we do about climate change now, it might not be the one that we should focus on first, but then I'm not a prediction, I'm a philosopher, that no one cares what I think, of those who make the decisions anyway. But I also think that the idea that there is something, that this dimension of historical responsibility is important, because I feel us disregarding this dimension entirely as insult to injury to those who didn't contribute as much and are suffering a lot.
Robert Judd from the University of Leicester. So, two things to say. First of all, just Pierre Strawson, you're thinking about responsibilities of social practice. So that's entirely about the ways in which you can go wrong about thinking about responsibility if you don't think seriously about the ways it's the social practice. It has some helpful things, I think, to say about how our judgments about responsibility are embedded in the actual social practice that we have. So the question is, if we're going to end up relying on the Spider-Man principle, which seems like a sensible principle, why we don't just use the Spider-Man principle from the beginning? So if we're going to say the people who need to solve the collective action problem of organising ourselves to organise to solve the collective action problem of climate change, why don't we just say the people who have the power to organise to end climate change should just do it? And that's the group of people that we need to identify. So what it seems like there might be a kind of going through too many steps to get to the conclusion. If you're going to endorse the Spider-Man principle, why don't you just endorse the Spider-Man principle?
Because I think the Spider-Man principle applies slightly different to, let's say, the historical context, the culpability context. And I think it is different from the ability to pay account in a significant manner. So I think we shouldn't conflate everything into the power responsibility principle, but keep these apart. I think as I understand this principle, it's what matters here is you have a responsibility not simply only because you can do something about it, but because you're in a unique position to do this. So if you're rich, you can do many things with your money. If you're a talented politician who has the gift of inspiring people, that's fairly particular. I mean, you can still use it for different ways. I think what the power responsibility, or Spider-Man principle say is that if you have that kind of gift, that kind of power, use it for good.
So is the thought that there's a kind of particular practical problem where that principle applies because of the nature of the problem, rather than kind of applying it to a more general set? Right, so then the question becomes, what's the feature of the practical problem that makes that particular principle relevant there and not in these other cases?
And I think it's particularly important for when it comes to institution building. So it's I'm really concerned with democracy. So the whole idea of giving particularly gifted people, supporting them and using their power to bring up a solution is grinding on me, because I don't like the idea of superhumans. But I think if people, I acknowledge that there are people who are in a particular position to influence more and carry more weight than other people and have a bigger impact, then I think they ought to put their impact into institutions that are then backed up democratically and created in a democratic spirit, so that the rest of us can exercise our right to participate in shaping the institutions under which we have to live as well. Even though they might be in a position to do it much more effectively and even better than involving people who mess up the whole idea.
I was going to ask exactly the same question, but now I've got this is good. Now my question follows on directly from that. So the Zelletin principle is the principle that if you have the unique, or perhaps just really strong, being stronger than everybody else, different, but something like that, ability to do something. And if you think in situations where there's some agent that's able, in that sense, to do something, then they have a strong responsibility to do it. I don't see why you can't kind of combine that with the ability to pay principle and say it's sort of the strength of your obligation is proportionate to your capacity relative to other people's capacities. And then just use that right from the beginning, right, what was suggested. So I guess I still don't see what it is that's special about institution building that means that we use the Spider-Man principle alone in that case, rather than some combination of that and just the straightforward ability to build institutions principle. Whereas when it comes to distributing obligations fairly from within that institution, we want to focus on wrongdoing or polluter pays kind of stuff.
I know that I have had a really strong reason why I wanted to keep these principles very separate and say they both have their sphere, they both have their relevance. I find ability to pay most plausible in the context of emergencies, not as a general principle for distributive justice. And ideally, I want to have institutions so that we can avoid emergencies where we have to call to people, oh, come up now, because I think overall it is fairer if we design institutions in such a way that everyone contributes, and everyone contributes in supporting the institutions as well as shaping the institutions, rather than running around in an emergency like, you've got money, give, please, emergency, people dying.
It's kind of weird with climate change, though, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, so I think there is a definite role for the ability to pay principle in the context of climate change. I don't deny that at all. I just think that we have this urgent role now to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. But I think there is a long-term agenda as well that we need to change the entire incentive structure so that we don't continue to cause climate change. So I think there are different elements of climate change. We need to prevent some really bad consequences right here and now, and that's urgent. We need to create institutions that are sustainable into the future to make sure that we don't get the same problem over and over again. And that's why I think the ability to pay is not the one that we need for the long-term perspective. It's the one that we need for the urgent action. Obviously, we need the urgent action before we think about the long-term stuff, but there's division of labor. Others can think about that.
Sue Scott, I'm a Institutional Research Institute affiliate. From it, an economist, just to ask a question. I'm following up on the people with power issue and the importance of institutions, and particularly at the supranational level, and looking at the overlaps between the economics and what you're talking about here, the business of powerlessness of people and the powerlessness of countries, vis-a-vis huge countries. This really points to some of the big log jams that we as economists see as preventing action, and two in particular I will name, that is subsidising of fossil fuels by some countries to a massive degree. There's your incentives. The wrong incentive, it should be the other way around. You shouldn't be subsidising these things. And then the other issue is, just jotted it down, the fact that countries are not allowed, like World Trade Organization, here's the other institution, rules, which doesn't allow you to keep out carbon-intensive imports. Now, okay, I've just pinpointed two small things which have huge implications. Now, where does this fit in to what you're talking about here?
Well,
democracy.
In my ideal philosophical world, we would create institutions that would think about, so how can we change the incentive structure? These incentives are clearly wrong if we want to have a planet that is habitable in the long term, even for poor people. In my ideal world, these institutions would choose the right criteria to say, well, we need to change the incentives to prevent climate change, to get more global justice. First of all, prevent climate change from happening and prevent the worst impacts from happening. Now, that would be what I would call the effective side, because it's all about stopping climate change. The democratic side of it would be the point that if one powerful organization somehow managed to push this agenda through, that would be good in one respect because it would achieve that goal, preventing climate change. But it would be bad in the sense they would use their own way of doing it without giving others a say, because there are different ways in how to prevent climate change. And I think people have a right to participate in the debate which way we choose, especially when it comes to the long-term agenda of not preventing harm that is, we need to act now, then we might not have the time to discuss this. But if we think about how shall we structure the world or social world in such a way that we don't get to this problem in 50 years again, people need to have a say. That's just my opinion.
I really like the idea of the democratic approach, but I was surprised that you didn't elaborate the democratic procedure as a moral principle itself, because it seems as though we're still thinking about institutions and democracy as being sort of neutral kind of architecture, and is the content of the deliberation that produces the normative principles. But to my mind, the democratic system sets certain moral boundaries. In democratic societies, the democracy defines the collective. We are, in a democracy, citizens in this collective. And therefore, it cuts away at all those other, potentially, I mean, obviously very ideally in an idealized setting, these other social variables that can divide us and pit one set of interests against another. So I think that there's a lot of potential for democratizing the decision making about climate change, because there isn't a straightforward normal answer to any of these problems. There's one single solution that's going to pop up, and nor is there going to be one single personality. Spider-Man himself made an appearance, and the extent to which issues get debated in democracy is very limited by a whole set of other factors and forces in society that require just as much investigation as the normative principles. So, but I think if we're looking at normative principles emerging out of a social practice, then we have to inquire deeply into our democracy.
Yeah, there were two things that I wanted to respond. So first of all, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, I don't think that democracy is like a neutral procedure. I think the reason why I am committed to the idea of doing something as foolish as to propose that we ought to deal with climate change democratically is because I'm normatively committed to the idea that people ought to have a say. I didn't say enough about what I think a proper working democracy is and how democracy ought to look like to fulfill this normative commitment. I simply suggested that the current system might be not perfect in that respect. So my account of democracy is normatively laden, but I don't, I do need to work that out in more detail. But I have the worry that it shouldn't be too normatively laden, to put in too much into the idea of democracy. I mean, one could put in an awful lot into the whole idea of democracy and say, like, if we are committed to democracy, then we are committed to citizens as free and equal and entitled to this kind of basic goods, and entitled to fair procedure, and entitled to this, and entitled to that. And the more conditions we pack into the idea of democracy, the more vulnerable it gets and the more difficult it gets. And it might be more helpful to say, like, this is central to democracy, and these are other very important concerns of justice that we need to consider as well, but we should keep that separate. So I try to find the right line as to saying democracy is more than giving everyone a vote, whether or not they're in a position to exercise it, actually. But it's less than making sure that we have a fully developed, decent, or well-ordered society before we can talk about democracy at all. Somewhere in the middle. Maybe not in the middle, but somewhere in between.
Right, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Alexa.